There is an oft overlooked intersection between mythology, psychology, and modern fantasy fiction. Now, this is something that I have attempted to wrangle with in my own fiction, but this author that we're talking to today has mastered their combination. A little while ago, I had the opportunity to talk with Erik D. Goodwyn, author of The King of the Forgotten Darkness, as well as a bunch of non-fiction books on Jungian psychology and psychiatry, and all these other scientific disciplines that you wouldn't really think have much to say about fantasy. But here's the thing about fantasy. It's kind of like a modern attempt to create a myth. You know, mythology, Odysseus and the like. What are these ancient stories, if not just stories about heroes killing dragons? It's fantasy. While it might not seem obvious at first, mythology has this intimate relationship with how our brains work, how we form memories, how we dream, why we dream. In a lot of ways, fantasy is a modern myth, which is in itself a collective dream of all humankind. Hi everyone, I'm James, an author, editor, and the owner of The Arcanist, an independent publisher dedicated to sharing excellent fantasy fiction. And we also love mythology. This is probably one of the most fascinating talks that I've ever had the opportunity to engage with. Erik Goodwyn has become a friend of mine over the course of a lot of pen palling, and what's interesting about this talk is that we've read each other's books. So it's not just me asking him about his book, but we kind of relate the topic of psychology and mythology into a conversation about both of our books as a whole. So if you're interested in my stuff, if you're interested in his stuff, this is going to be a really rich conversation for you. But before we get into it, I wanted to let you know that in just a couple short weeks, maybe even less than that, the literary fantasy magazine and Mordschlag, Sword and Sorcery magazine, are coming to Backer Kit, where you can get sword and sorcery, literary fantasy, or both. TLFM is really focused on the mythological fantasy, that high fantasy that follows a mythic narrative. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, there's a lot of it there. If you prefer action-oriented pulp fantasy, Mordschlag is for you, dedicated to the craft of Thu-bound heroic fantasy. And also, kind of a cool thing in there, we've put in Monsters and Encounters for Shadow Dark RPG. This is the Arcanist event of the year. If you're interested in our magazines or any book we've published, this is the place to get them at the best price they'll be available. Follow the Backer Kit campaign now to get the 2025 issues of Literary Fantasy for free and get a novelette from Mordschlag, penned by myself in tandem with Lee Patton. Now, without further ado, I introduce Erik D. Goodwyn. Hi everyone, I'm here with Dr. Erik Goodwyn, a psychiatrist, a Jungian scholar, and a fantasy author. I could talk about what he's done all day, but how about I just let him do it instead?
Well, glad to be here. Like you said, I'm a psychiatrist. I've been doing that for about 20 years. But my passion has always been fantasy writing, and I've been working on my fantasy stuff for about 30 years, so 10 years longer than I've been working on being a psychiatrist. However, learning psychiatry and working with people with mental illnesses and all of that kind of stuff, and particularly once I started getting into the world of Carl Jung and the archetypes, and not just Jung, but because a lot of psychodynamic schools actually talk about dreams, but dreams is what really drew me in to the field as a whole. And it was great when I was in residency and I started learning about dreams. It was like, finally, I get to really focus on this because I'm learning to be a psychiatrist and we need to know that. So I dived into neuroscience and genetics and all of this stuff. And I'm still going with that. We're learning all kinds of new stuff about that. But then, of course, I got a chance to work with people and they would tell me their dreams. And you start to see the patterns that are there and how dreams work. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that my love of fantasy was there the whole time, driving the whole thing, because fantasy and dreams are densely interconnected. So that's kind of been one of the driving forces behind all of my work. If you were trying to rope it all together, because it seems like I'm all over the place, I'm doing mental health and over here and writing videos, and my channels should probably feel like they're everywhere because I'm talking about folk tales and all that kind of jazz. But that's the core of it, is that the imagination is at the center of all of this stuff. And mental health issues a lot of times involve using the imagination to heal. So I thought, well, that's a lot of what fantasy stories are about too, at their heart. And your great book, Ashen Rider, has definitely got a lot of that going on in it, about redemption and all of that. So, I mean, it's all there, but we tend to think of fantasy as kind of frivolous entertainment. It's just for kids, and it's, kind of goofy. Those of us who love fantasy, of course, know better than that. And the greats have known better than that, like Tolkien and all of those folks. But yeah, so that's what I'm up to.
Fantastic. Well, there's actually a couple of sources I want to talk about. There's an essay I read recently from Stephen Donaldson, and where he talks about the modern construction of an epic. And when I think about, what I was surprised to learn in my undergraduate degree was just how interconnected mythology is with the field of psychology. I think one of the things that turned me on to doing a minor in psych was I had taken a world mythology class, and we started talking about Jung. And I didn't realize that at the time. And diving into that, we see that psychology and mythology and fantasy, all these things are interconnected with each other. Like fantasy is extremely dreamlike. Mythology has those archetypes, and these archetypes appear in our dreams. Let's talk about that interconnection for a little bit, how that is influencing your creation of I described it in my review as a modern myth.
Well,
do you see it that way?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the intent behind it. I think that is ultimately the function of fantasy and myth itself, is that it works like a dream does, except a dream is about the individual, whereas a myth is as if a whole society is having a dream about its pervasive concerns and issues. So if you really look at dreams and you understand what they are, it's that the brain has a really tough job. It's got to take in a massive amount of sensory info that's bombarding it nonstop all day long and figure out what the hell it means. So it does that in a number of different ways. So it takes all that information and it spends a ton of energy integrating it in the best way that it can. And one of the ways it does that is through the formation of an ego identity of this is me, this is how I relate, because much of our landscape is social in nature, just because we're humans. Humans pour in massive amounts of work into social adaptation, because in our evolutionary history, social adaptation equaled physical survival. If you got separated from the social group, you were toast. So getting separated from the group became equated with death, because it might as well be. In evolutionary terms, like natural selection favored people that thought of their place in the tribe being as important as life and death. So then that means that we put a whole lot of our emotional energy into social adaptation. And a big part of that is when the brain is working on social identity, but also autobiographical memory, emotional regulation, and future planning, and all of that stuff culminates in a dream narrative. So when we're asleep, our brain has time to actually work on this stuff. And it's something called the default mode network kicks into overdrive. And it's a part of the brain that's operating in the background all the time, working on all this integration. And it kind of turns off when you're focusing on something difficult that's in front of you, like a problem, like whatever algebra problem or something like that. But then once that work is done, the default mode network shifts in and says, all right, we're going to go back to this other stuff and figure out what in the heck the last 5 days was all about. Right? Okay, so part of what happens there is it constructs your memories and consolidates them. That's the what happened. But the brain's not done. At that point, the brain says, okay, well, I know what happened, but I don't know what the hell it means. So I'm going to take that stuff that happened, I'm going to break it down into little pieces, restructure it into a symbolic narrative that says this is what it means. It's as if this happened. If I'm working on too difficult, I'm stuck at a difficult point in my life. I'm trying to make a decision between two alternatives. I might dream about being at a crossroads where one path leads to sunshine and daisies, and the other pathway leads to the dark valley of monsters, or something like that. Or it may not be even that vivid. But the advantage of the dream, the advantage of the brain being able to do this is that it can just ignore physics. It can ignore the laws of inertia and everything else. And that is why it's fantasy. And that's why the oldest stories are fantasy. That's why before there were psychiatrists and psychologists, there were storytellers, because they could take my current life emotional situation and say, it's as if this fantastical narrative is happening. So the biggest problem that people have with this is if they take the stories that their brain produces automatically, literally, they'll never understand what in the hell they're dreaming about. It'll be this gemish of nonsense. But if you recognize that it's an as if narrative, and it's about you and how your life is going, then you're onto it. And then you can work with it in therapy. And one of the things I love about doing this in therapy is if I can figure out what a dream, like particularly if a recurrent nightmare, if a person comes in, they have a recurrent nightmare and they're like, I don't understand what this is about. If I can figure out what it's about and help give that back to them and it resonates with them, they'll stop having the dream. And they'll think you're some kind of dream wizard. And it's so very dramatic, because and it's just because culturally we tend to dismiss dreams as just, I had too much pizza last night, har. Stupid crap like that. And no, it has meaning. It's very powerful and emotionally meaningful. So then translate that into fantasy and myth. In fantasy and myth, we're really kind of doing the same thing, only it's not just the story of me, it's the story of us. And it's an as if narrative. So like your creation stories, they have very similar structure around the world, because those are stories of how the hell did we, all of us, get here? Again, you take it literally, it doesn't match with science, it's pure nonsense. But if you take it figuratively and emotion and like from a point of view of the birth of consciousness, which we all have an experience of that, whether we remember it or not, it's there. Then it can start to make sense. Then it starts to make sense of of the typical patterns you see in a creation myth. I just had a video on my various channels where I talk about a patient who came in with a dream that was almost exactly the same as the Prometheus myth. There wasn't the theft of fire, but the dreamer was nailed to or chained to a cliff, and below him was a churning ocean, and there was this big bird ripping out his organs. I'm like, whoa, that's almost verbatim. But he was going through a really, really challenging time. And so he kept having this dream, and that was what it was about. It was as if he was being stuck in this mythic situation.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had mentioned to me in an email John Truby's mythic storytelling training. Mm-hmm. I purchased that course. I went through the material. Some of it I went through multiple times.
Yep.
I want to touch on the idea of birth and rebirth and how that is important to a mythic hero. Because in your book, I see those intentionally placed. And I don't think I caught every single one. Mm-hmm. But like, what is the significance? This is what I've been wondering since learning about this, is what is the significance of a rebirth for a heroic journey? Well,
the heroic journey is about maturation and change of the egoic self. So a person will have dreams that are mythic in character when they're going through big changes in their life. And so like somebody who's kind of just chilling and vibing and not really dealing with much is not going to bother with that. Their brain doesn't need that. Their brain will be dreaming about exploration and play. And it'll be difficult to interpret their dreams, actually. But when they're going through a whole lot of emotional crap, it's easier to interpret their dreams because they're more channeled along time-tested pathways. Now, in the rebirth business, there's a thing about death in a dream or metaphorical narrative, and that it's, again, if you take it literally, it doesn't make much sense. But as a metaphor, it's about change, and the rebirth bit is about who you were. You go through this dramatic situation, and you come out on the other end of it a different person. You're kind of the same, but you're not the same anymore. Well, what's a great way to depict that visual spatially as a rebirth? And oftentimes there's water involved. So baptismal type imagery. I've also written books on the psychology of ritual and how that plays into treatment. It's called Healing Symbols in Psychotherapy. So I get into that where I look at rituals around the world too. Very similar patterns that you see in myths. Same thing. Same metaphorical ideology. So yeah, there's a couple of points in King of the Forgotten Darkness where both of the characters go through this kind of death and rebirth bit. And on a certain level, the fantastical imagery is actually superior to any sort of verbal explanation of it. Like I was saying earlier, the brain's job is to try to make sense of who I am and what my life is about right now. But if it could do that with just a block of text, that's exactly what the brain would do, because natural selection doesn't like to waste energy. Right? But it can't, right? It cannot encapsulate the full blood and guts lived experience of what we're dealing with. So it uses visual spatial images to make sense of it. And so it'll take whatever nebulous, churning, conflicted feelings that I'm having, and it'll say, it's as if this visual spatial thing is happening with objects and characters moving around. So like if I have a big internal conflict, say, I might dream about me having an argument with somebody who has an opposing position, but it's really me against me.
Yeah.
Right? Unless the character is somebody I actually know. So this is one thing people mess up with dream interpretations, is they'll say, well, I'm having this argument with this other person. Well, maybe the other person is a substitute for your mother, right? It's a classic psychoanalytic thing. But if that were the case, this is one of the things Jung talks about. The psyche is not diplomatic. It says what it means. You just need to remember it's a symbol. So stick with it. Stick with the image. So if it's an abstract character, then it's more likely to be you versus another like part of yourself that you're debating with, say. And so it's just an easier way to understand the stuff that I'm dealing with. And so it happens like that. I feel like I got lost on answering your question.
Well, it leads me into my next one. So,
okay.
Arentir's very much an externalization of Liam's trauma. Mm-hmm. You know, at least within the context of this story.
Yeah.
That's something that Donaldson brings up in his essay, that fantasy, one of the main functions is to externalize whatever the characters are going through internally. And I find that's ringing very true through your work. And I think it rings true through in the book that I wrote, because that is very much autobiographical, even though I've never journeyed through, a Dante-inspired hell. But,
I would hope not. It's pretty scary.
That'd be weird. But it's like, these guides show up, and they're strange fairy creatures. His kinsmen kind of show up. These things are placed in his path, and it's the same way with Mia, who's the secondary protagonist, but in a different way. Just for the sake of this conversation, I'll focus on Liam. Mm-hmm. And when you are dreaming, and you're going through something, you're having a mythic dream, trying to put these things together, you're going to encounter versions of your extensions of yourself that are going to provide a certain function. So yeah. Is that how you saw like Seabreeze and all these other characters in the narrative? They're even what's his name? King Vinraith.
Yeah.
He started to seem very compassionate almost by the end of the story, or at least in some way I don't know, mournful, like the bad thing is happening, but I'm not exactly happy about it. That's kind of what I got
Hmm.
from him. I mean,
Hmm.
does that sound like I'm on the right track there?
Oh yeah, definitely. Now, I mean, I focused on telling a standalone story more or less with, background that we can expand on later, which of course I've done. This is not, like I said, it's 9 books altogether. And so, a lot of what you're seeing is also, it's not just Liam, but for the whole series, as these characters are important because, um, many characters will have different versions of themselves in everyone. So that's an archetype. That's essentially that. So, like you say, the guide to the dead, the all mother, that kind of stuff. Everybody has versions of this in their head. So they kind of have an objective reality of their own. In a fantasy story, you can just do that, say they're gods or something like that, immortals, whatever. But that said, the way they present to Liam is extremely relevant to his journey, and same for Mia. Liam, like you said, his journey is very much about trauma and how do I get through that in a way that's emotionally realistic, even if it's fantastical. So his problem is having been almost killed and having all these losses. Mia's problem is, it's kind of I won't say a mirror image of it, but it's related to it because her problem is neglect, is basically abandonment. And so, but what I hope to show is that can often lead to the same kinds of presentations. There's a lot of anger behind both experiences, and that's just coming from clinical experience. Like I know that that's what that does because I see it all the time. And so, but it's got a different character and flavor to it. And so that's one of the ways. Plus, they're two different people too. But even in that case, the Vinwraith, for example, who is in many ways at the very beginning, is almost like the voice of his own survival guilt. If he were to, if that were to be externalized, it would be in that character. And then, even just the idea of entering into Arantir is, as presented, a journey into another physical world through a gate. But if you look at it from a psychological view, it's a journey inwardly, into the collective unconscious and all that. And in later books, I play around with that a whole lot more, and you'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that's a cool way to do it. Moving back to just referencing our conversation from earlier, where I have trouble with second worlds that are futuristic, and then just how important this second world is to this story, because that crossing over is extremely important. I mean, it's like you said, it's taking the internal and physically making it external, and you are crafting the fantasy right in front of the reader.
Right. And that's essentially what the brain is doing every night when we're dreaming, is it's taking our inner conflicts and turmoils and turning them into externalized visual spatial narratives. And this is one of the challenges that you can have in fantasy, because if you're wanting, and we didn't talk about this before, but just on the interface of mental health and fantasy in general, like some authors are trying to attack the issue of like depression or trauma or whatever it is in a psychologically realistic way, which is good. That's fine. But you got to remember, if you're using fantasy, you don't want to forget about the tools that fantasy has, which is the ability to take those things and make them externalized conflicts so that you can see them better. So, if you're not careful, though, those things can kind of bump into each other. Like if, just look at the way that things like schizophrenia are seen in other cultures as demon possessions or, spirits and all that kind of stuff. Well, in a fantasy world, that stuff is real. And in fact, throughout majority of our history as a species, it wasn't fantasy. It was magic and spirits and gods and all that stuff. it was just a regular Tuesday, right? So it wasn't fantasy. But we in the modern world, and that's something I always have to try to remember, is that we have this weird worldview that emerged from our post-Enlightenment, post-Protestant legacy in the West that says most of that stuff is not real. And so all of that's just imagination. It's just in your head, blah, blah, blah. So that particular thing is partly what I'm critiquing in the description of the universe of the series as having these two worlds. One world where there isn't that much magic and there's really not much else of interest going on, except using technology to make our lives more and more convenient. Like you said in your review, to the logical extreme of what we're doing now, versus the other world, which is full of all of the craziness that we've dealt with throughout our history. So it's kind of a journey into the past as well.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people looking backward right now. I'm definitely one of them where, we make an effort we do things the hard way as much as we can here. We live in a very agricultural community. We're surrounded by trees and plants, so we have a garden, and we try to grow our own food. We make our own bread, and we want to carry that out into like doing a homestead one day once we can buy some land and trying to be as self-sufficient as possible. And I see that in a lot of people around my age especially, but just all over the place, who are tired of this. It's instant gratification. It's just the fact that we can have whatever we want at the click of a button. You just swipe your credit card. First of all, it's a terrible financial habits that it's building, but it's also enslaving us to debt and to this mindset of I want what I want right now. I mean, people can't even sit down to read a short book anymore. There's more people who want to write a book and fervently defend their right to never read than there are people who are reading books. And
yes, I really like that video that you cover that subject.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I got so many mad.
He said the thing that needed to be said. It's true. It's true. But now part of that is because of that creativity it's there, like whether we want it to or not, and whether our world is really finds it useful or not. You can almost liken it to the immune system, right? We never encounter the kinds of germs that our ancestors dealt with, but the immune system is designed to deal with that and not a perfectly sterile environment all the time. So what happens? Well, one theory is that that's where a lot of our inflammatory diseases come from, one of which is depression. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons why depression may be on the rise, has been on the rise. It's not maybe, it has been on the rise for decades. So that's one theory. But again, that's another reason that I set up this world the way that I did. Said I wanted to provide that contrast. Arantir is messy and bloody and painful, but also beautiful in ways you never could have imagined, and surprising, and it's I would hope be meaningful to people to find out what happens when you have the two estranged friends go in, but they find through all of that chaos and pain what their relationship really is about. And it never would have played out that way if they'd have stayed in Midworld. So, and that was some of the subtext there.
Yeah. There is, so you wrote for a younger audience. So there are moments where you just say what they're feeling, right? You use the word. But then there is so much subtlety in how you have laid this out, right? Because everything is placed with intention. It reads that way. There's nothing that's just like, oh, I thought it'd be fun if orcs attacked because orcs are orcs. And there are no orcs that have appeared yet. I don't know. But
oh yeah, they're there. They're just not in this book.
That is why a story like this is so important in this time, is because it not only and this is a huge compliment, I have a hard time reading when I am tired. I'll fall asleep reading my favorite books, but this one is easy to read. It's just enjoyable. I don't have to really, have my analysis brain going on overdrive, but then at the same time, there's all these subtle layers of things that were placed, and then I start thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. Why is that there? So you've reached this middle ground where, I mean, it's fantastic for it's absolutely fantastic for the younger reader, because you're almost tricking them into being more thoughtful.
Yeah, that was exactly the idea.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be accessible and enjoyable on the surface level. If that's all you want to read it at, then you can do that with ease. But for readers who look deeper, like yourself, and quite a few others who've come back to me with feedback, they see the other layers that are in there, the Easter eggs and stuff that I put in there. There's stuff there that you won't see the significance of until 2 books or 5 books from now. But I'm not just talking about that, like Brandon Sanderson type stuff. I'm talking more about that's right there on the page. If you notice it, it's great. If you don't, it doesn't hurt anything. You can keep trucking, and it's still fun. Like there's a question I ask everybody that has read this, and that's if they figured out the identity of the Fairy Queen. And we don't have to answer that here for spoiler reasons, but the answer is right there. It's just that if you blink, you might miss it. And it does have a great deal of a significance too, because of the very last scene when you see her doing something and it's like, wait a minute, why would she be doing that? Holy shit, that changes everything. So yeah, enjoy that for what it's worth. But yeah, that was intentional. I wanted to try to do that. So that if somebody just wanted to have fun with it and not think too much, they could still do that.
It makes me think of shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender was one.
Yes.
That show was coming out when I was about 5 years old. And it has stuck with me throughout my life. And it is such a well-crafted story that's family-oriented. I hesitate to call it a kid's show because it deals with some very real topics. But it has tricked me into being thoughtful from a very young age, because it's presenting these things in an intentional way that resonates with children, even if they don't really know why. And then you grow up. I feel like, the stories make us, they forge us. And if you grow up watching and consuming these, I hate to use the word consuming, if you are interacting with these thoughtful tales that are written by emotionally mature people who are trying to, showcase morality in a realistic, reasonable way, then you're going to be set up better as you get older than if you were just watching whatever terrible
Paw
stuff
Patrol
is out there. Just mindless garbage.
Stuff to sell toys.
Stuff to sell toys. That's exactly what it is. If that makes sense. So, your publishing journey, I am curious. So, I had assumed that this book was self-published. I didn't realize that you had worked with the publisher. I know you're still querying for book 2. So, tell me about your experience with traditional publishing, and do you have any thoughts on indie?
Well, when I first started trying to get things published, there was no such thing as indie publishing and no such thing as self-publishing. All submissions were by snail mail, because I was doing this before the ancient times, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and there was no internet. And I've watched it change over the years. And for a long time, there was always talk of vanity presses and how you should avoid them because they're just a scam. And when self-publishing first started to be talked about more seriously, people were still very leery of it and saying, well, it's really just a vanity press scam and stuff like that. But then you got print on demand, which doesn't require as much upfront. And so I think that the scammers, were maybe not quite as a big part of the story there. Nevertheless, I started out with a huge passion for writing, but I had zero skill. So everything I wrote was garbage. It's just the way it is. And so I couldn't get anything published back in those days. And as I went on and I took more classes and I, honed my craft and tried to get better, self-publishing became a real possibility. But I was just kind of stubborn and wanted to do a traditional press of some kind. But I was ready to say, all right, I'm tired of this, just because it's just flooded. There's just so much out there, and I'm sure much of it is really, really good. I've read some great self-published novels now that would never have seen the light of day. So I wound up with Collective Ink, the imprint of which is Roundfire Press that printed this, a small press, nothing huge. And that's kind of where I settled on, but it's very, very difficult to, and a lot of it has to do with the blurb. And, if you can sell that, then, you might get some buy-in, but it's been very frustrating. And there have been a lot of times when I was like, to hell with this, and I wouldn't touch it for a couple of years sometimes. But then it was always in the back of my head going, yeah, well, maybe you'll have better luck this time. Take some more classes, Read some more John Truby or Dara Marks or whatever. Rob McKee.
Eventually you got there. You worked something out with Collective Ink.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm asking selfishly because I want to know what other people's experiences are like. Because that's part of my work at The Arcanist is I help other authors. I, act as a small press. I'm their editor. I'm their PR. I'm their marketing. What was your experience like working with this traditional publisher? Did they have you on strict deadlines? You're pulling out your hair, or did you find it to be a very enlightening experience where you learned a lot from who you were working with?
Kind of in the middle of that. Like, I didn't have to worry too much about deadlines because once I got to that stage of it and I presented it to them and they said, yeah, we'll publish this. They have different tiers. And mine is the second level. Like first level is where they push it a little bit harder because they think it's got more potential, say. And the second tier is where they do believe that there's something there, but they're not willing to like put the full court press on it necessarily. And then levels 3 and 4 are more in the self-publishing range. So Collective Ink is kind of a unique model. It's kind of a hybrid almost. At those other tiers, it is a hybrid because you're putting money up front for the marketing. The level I was at, there wasn't any of that from me. I didn't put any money up front to market it. I have done some of my own marketing anyway because they expect you to do that. And I think that's across the board now. Everybody expects you to do that. You got Book Talk, you got Bookstagram and all that. And that's where a lot of the sales are going, are coming from. But at the same time, they still send books to bricks and mortar stores. So it's a real deal, and that's cool. It's a challenge because you don't get like a super personal touch because they just don't have the staff for that. A lot of it's funded by writers. That's why it's called Collective Ink.
I see.
So it's writers trying to help out writers by forming their own independent publishing house in a sense, like as a collective.
Nice.
So so there's that. But nevertheless, they were there and they were very helpful with suggestions and they helped me figure out book signings, which is a lot of fun. I love doing that. So I think it's been a good experience. Of course, I have higher aspirations. I want to see bigger numbers.
Yeah.
But at least it's gotten to that point, and I've had, several people say, this is good stuff. Keep going. And that's really what it's about for me. I've got a day job, right? I don't need to do this to pay the bills. Mm-hmm. Just doing it for the passion.
Yeah, and I find as a fellow day job haver,
first most of us are.
Having something that isn't writing is extremely rejuvenating when you do get to finally sit back down. If I were writing all day, I don't think I'd be getting up at 3:30 in the morning and writing.
No.
I wouldn't have any desire to do that.
No. No, I couldn't. I think I was watching Sanderson again, and he was talking about his schedule. I mean, the dude is like a freaking machine. You know, he writes like 6 hours a day or something crazy. I could not do that. Like I'm a one and done kind of guy. Like if I can manage 2 hours, if I can carve that time out and spend it all writing, that's a victory.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't write 500,000 word monstrosities either.
Yeah, you have to carve your whole life. Those books have gravitational pulls.
Yeah.
I also just find the concept or the idea of putting financial strain on writing to be incredibly troubling. I feel like there's no quicker way to kill something you love than to do it for a living.
Yeah.
I work in IT by day, and my job started as I fixed the gaming computers that my company sells. And I thought, that's the coolest job ever because I love putting together gaming computers. Nowadays, I tell people, if I could never see a computer again, it would be too soon. I'm so sick of computers. I'm surrounded by them all the time. And I'm just glad that that's not, because, you know, writing fantasy, that's my passion. I don't want to look at my bookshelf and just be like, oh God.
Yeah, I feel that. What did you think of Truby's stuff?
Oh yeah, I really enjoyed it. Didn't just enjoy it. I've already started applying it. So I guess what I'm a little frustrated about is because it's a lecture, it's just not super in depth. So I'm like, oh man, I need more information. And so I'm returning, like he talks about 7 archetypes that show up in stories a lot. And I'm like, well, I want to know, I don't know why I can't wrap my head around this, but ever since, you know, taking those initial classes and whatever small amount of Jungian research I've done, I can't really give people a list of things. So I'm kind of just wanting somebody to say, here's 30 archetypes that show up all the time. But then I'm also
there's a reason for that, and it's because Jung, when he was trying to describe the concept of the archetype, he really struggled because it was more of an intuition for him, and the language is sometimes confusing and seemingly contradictory. And not only that, but he kind of changed the way that he talked about archetypes from the beginning of his career to the end of his career. And scholars ever since then, and I've been in the middle of this debate for about 15 years now, have been arguing about what he really meant. And if there's some way we can define it more, nail it down more. And it gets even worse if you get into like the lay population discussing archetypes. It goes from archetypes are these super rigid, there's only 6 of them, and it's exactly A, B, C, D, and E, to another group of people that see archetypes in absolutely everything. And well, that's not very useful either.
Yeah.
One is way too prescriptive and the other one is just goo, right? So the way I look at it is, I think you can explain what an archetype is. In fact, I just submitted a paper about this to the Journal of Analytical Psychology. That's probably the biggest of the Jungian journals in the world. And I've published with them over the years several times. Great bunch. But I've been obsessed with this question from the beginning of my scholarly career. What the hell is an archetype exactly? Can we define this? So, long story short, and I mean, it's a long story. It's essentially, think of it this way. If I were to say, grow up in Hawaii and 85 degrees all year round, and it's been warm and like that for my entire life, and I suddenly just get the urge to go to Iceland, and I get off the plane and it's super cold. I've never experienced this before, but my body knows what to do. It shifts the blood flow from the extremities into the internal organs. You get this thing called the Lewis reaction, where it causes the blood to perfuse the limbs at a rate that allows it to conserve heat, but also not allow them to die, and so forth and so on. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that I'm going into a situation I've never encountered before, but there's something about the body that knows what to do. That's the core of what an archetype is. Only instead of a physiological instinctive reaction, it's a psychological, spontaneous thought type of reaction. So when I am a young man and I'm struggling to find my place in the world as an adult, my meaning-making brain that's always trying to put together my life and put it into story form will come up with hero's journey type stories. If I am just encountering the mating sphere, I'll have dreams about the anima or the animus, depending on what gender I am and what my sexual orientation is. I could go on and on. There's many, many examples of this. So like the mother archetype, the divine child, which is something you see all the time in people going to therapy, where I'm trying to foster in a new version of myself that's young and vulnerable, but has almost infinite potential. What's a great way to depict that? A divine child, which finds itself in myths and around the world independently. So what's going on there? So that's an archetype. So archetypes are stories that are essentially responses to or anticipations of universal conflicts that we all face. So this is why you can't pin it down and say it's just this character or it's just that character. That's way too simple. Yeah. It's not just a character. It's a whole story network, and sometimes multiple characters are involved, like the Senex and the Puer dynamic, which would be the master and the student. And that's an archetype that emerges at a particular point in life when you need it. That says you need to go find the wise man in the woods, or the wise woman who knows all the grandmother who knows all the stories and all that kind of stuff. So, the hero's journey, all of that kind of jazz.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So that helps me wrap my head around it a little bit more. It also assuages some of my frustrations because several of the examples of characters he gave I just felt like they were incorrect. So he says,
yeah, take some of that stuff with a grain of salt. His stuff about the craft of writing is top notch, IMO, but the Jungian stuff he gets screwed up a little bit, and that's so common. I just shrug it off.
Yeah, so the narrative beats were really interesting. I paid a lot of. I didn't realize how much myth is in pop culture.
Oh yeah,
which makes complete sense now that I talking with you about this, reading your book with that perspective, the training, some essays I read, it's all just kind of coming together, helping me to. I mentioned I'm rewriting a book for the third time, fourth writing of it, and the first two rewrites that I did, I just had the documents open and I mimicked the plot structure. And this was the first book I ever wrote, and it's just riddled with, I wrote this when I was 22, so, that's why this character does this behavior, because I thought it was deep or fun or just decided that arbitrarily. So I had this moment where I needed to take a step back from my current book. The current book I'm working on, it's interesting because I usually will write a terrible first draft and then I'll rewrite. And that's how I released Ashen Rider. That's how I've done everything before. But we do a serial release at the Arcanist where we run for 6 months. A section comes out every month. My main character was originally, for the third unwritten books thus far, he was an older man, towards like the end of his life. He was a veteran, and his first incarnation was very insecure. And the ultimate decision I made was I'm bringing in young men, and having them take the helm, because this older man needs to be more of a guide. His story is already done. He's already been through his traumas and faced them. And his sister needs to kind of go through her own kind of middle journey. And this young man in the beginning, and this 14-year-old boy really, who's her son, his nephew. That's going to pull the whole family unit together, where it was more kind of separate and nebulous, ill-defined. That's all a very long rant to describe just how thinking about how these mythic qualities are pulling it all together, where instead of just little bits and pieces of mythology, I now have this framework in my head where I'm able to sit down and really think about, like, how is this going to look like a real myth, rather than just, I like reading about mythology and then wrote a book with that, like the LaCroix of mythology.
Right. Well, it's almost like a gravitational self-organization process that happens. In one of my earlier scholarly papers, I talk about archetypes. One way of looking at them would be as attractor states in the field of possible narratives. They just pull stories towards them all the time. And so that's why you have these beats that happen unintentionally in the process of putting the story together. You're like, oh yeah, that's got to be that, Well, why is that the case, And you can see this in folklore studies where, for example, there was one study, this guy named Max Luthi. He was a folklorist from the 80s and 90s. And he was talking about how the story of Rapunzel, they had Grimm's version of it, which was written in the 1880s or whatever. But they also had actual like recordings and transcripts of storytellers in the communities in Germany talking about that story. And one of the things that Luthi pointed out was that what Grimm, and this folklorists have identified this now, that when the Grimm brothers put the stuff to paper, like Jacob Grimm in particular, they made them more literary. They added some stuff that wasn't really in the oral version of the story. And most of it had to do with like describing the internal motivations of the characters, even just tiny little bits and pieces for the fairy tales. But the original oral versions of those didn't have that. And then afterwards, after the book was published, they went back to listen to the storytellers again, and the story had re-corrected back to the original version. So folk tales do this over time. One particular storyteller might go off on a tangent or whatever, but the next time somebody tells it, it goes back to the way it was before. That's unusual. Like it's like the opposite of the telephone game.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. That's really fascinating. And so that's how you can have there was one study that was looking at cross-cultural linguistics and families of Indo-European languages, and they used this to analyze folk tales. And they said that of the Indo-European versions of the Beauty and the Beast story, they could trace back to something like 4,000 years ago or more.
Oh, wow.
Well, I mean, that's impressive that a story could survive that many generations of storytellers and still have largely the same structure. Also, not terribly surprising considering that same story structure is found in other cultures outside of the Indo-European language. But still, that begs the question, what's up with that? But it's because of the psychological resonance of it. Like they speak to these emotional realities, but in the images and symbols, and that's the way that they are understood. And to use the word that you and I both hate, consumed. So you just sort of go with it and it feels right. And that's the extent of the thought that goes into it. But there's so much going on there. So, yeah.
That's a thought I've had a lot with trying to craft these stories where I've heard in order to create something that is appealing to the unconscious is this idea where you almost want to do it intrinsically and using your instinct rather than analysis. But then at the same, I hate that. I don't know if that's even a real thing, but I think that was my intrinsic instinct, was to kind of lean that way. But then I'm a formalist as a writer. I think about this, why these things are the way they are, what I'm assembling on the page. It's almost scientific sometimes, especially in the revision stage. So then Truby says in his training, you can try to do this by feel, but you're going to miss something, and there will be huge gaps in your story. And he was talking about the story world, specifically these components. On that, what do you think? He made the argument that there is always an extreme, a heaven or a hell. I don't know if that's always true.
Well, I think when I was listening to that, what I took from that is that in fantasy, you want the landscape itself to be a symbol of psychological meaning of some kind. And he uses the example of Lord of the Rings, where you've got Mordor is kind of the hellscape and Lorien is like the heavenscape. And I think that there's certainly something to be said about that, in the sense that the journey, if the journey is going to be a mythic kind of redescription of our emotional journey through life, we're going to have ups and downs. We're going to have moments that feel as if they were in hell and or in heaven. And so I think that's what I took away from that. And I think he makes the argument, if you don't do that, you're missing out on an opportunity. And that's probably true. Because again, with fantasy, why not do that? Because you literally have no constraints. So you can do that if you want. Now, of course, what I argue is that the strength of fantasy can also be its downfall as well, because everything in writing is a trade-off. And if you have the ability to make anything possible, then it's also very possible to make fantasy appear completely nothing but pure fluff. And so you've got to anchor it to real emotion for that to work. I felt like Ashen Rider did that really well, because you were using these levels of hell, but then also of these beautiful as places as well to capture that feeling. So, and it really kind of puts you in that. It's as if I'm experiencing this beautiful landscape. Well, that's what the redemption feels like. And so that's how it hit me anyway. That's how I read it.
That's absolutely what I was thinking. And it's a symbol that I like to use a lot. The landscape is extremely powerful. And now I'm thinking of it more recently as like, okay, well, I do this because of this reason. But linking back to the autobiographical nature of Ashen Rider, to give you a little bit of background of what had happened in my life, around the time I was 22 years old, and my mom died of brain cancer. She was actually a very well-respected family marriage therapist. So that's kind of where my interest in the field had come from. Was talking with her and kind of digging through her books after she passed. But she had brain cancer. She was so smart, and then she just reduced to a shell of herself. And that was traumatic. And I found myself moving back in with my dad. We're grieving together. I lost my job because I was so depressed. I had developed narcolepsy. And I didn't think I was going to live through that for a very long time. And then we moved from California to Indiana, and that drive was 5 days of pure hell. I had 3 cats in the back of my Subaru, and I remember just like breaking down and weeping in a hotel room in the Flagstaff, Arizona. But by the time I got to Indiana, it was like a rebirth. I had achieved this huge transition. I went to this weird place that I didn't want to be in, and then I quickly found that this was where I'm supposed to be. This is my home. And I had a moment around my first month here. I was hiking by myself in the winter, and I tried crossing this lake bed. And there's wilderness here in Indiana, unlike anything that I experienced in California. I was in the valley. It was all farms and suburbs. So there's no woods. Didn't know woods. And I ended up sinking right into the closest thing to quicksand I've ever experienced.
Wow.
Took about 10 to 15 minutes to escape that. And this was right in the peak of my I don't think I want to live.
A dark night of the soul.
Yes. And as I'm pulling myself out or trying to, the trees part or whatever, the clouds part, and a ray of sunlight just fell right onto me. And that was when I decided to live my life again, that I didn't want to die. That moment, after the hell that I had gone through to that time, is Katerina's emergence from pandemonium, when she
Absolutely
feels the riverbed, the birds chirping, all the nature in my fiction is here, what's around me. It's very much Mediterranean in concept, but it's southern Indiana, Kentucky for nature.
I thought I recognized the pennyroyal in there. I'm from Kentucky myself, so.
Oh yeah. You'll find a lot of familiar things then. Down to the limestone. I love limestone.
Oh yeah.
So Katerina went off and she built her life, and that's what I've done since that moment. You know, I'm about to get married to the love of my life.
Congratulations.
You know, it's been several years of being a much healthier person, and writing has helped me on that journey too a lot. So
absolutely, I have similar. There's some similar stuff going on in Kingdom of Forgotten Darkness. There's some of the dreamlike imagery that is in there was not me sitting down and plotting it out. It was from dreams that I actually had. And I'll let any who read it to figure out which one's which. But you know, I've spoken before about how part of the main story, of course, is Liam trying to rescue his mother, and then that was a personal part of the story for me. Interestingly enough, I was the same age when my mom passed away from cancer. It's breast cancer. And before that, she was a single mom. I was an only child. So like, she was kind of like my whole world. So that came crashing down on me. Maybe not as hard as it did on you. I had some other mitigating factors in there, but I mean, it was a rough journey. And so some of that and what Liam experiences is me kind of working through that too. And kind of capturing the magic, as it were, as being passed on and so forth. So it's incredible the healing power the stories have. And you don't really, you know, it's a platitude. People say that all the time. Oh, yes, the healing power of myth. But until you see it or you experience it yourself, it's just fluff. It's people talking, you know. But once you experience it, you're like, yeah, that does. And why does that work? Well, it works because it contextualizes everything.
Yeah. It's
as if I went through pandemonium, but then I saw the light at the end of that. And I found this beautiful, beautiful place that I don't have to suffer anymore like that. And I can get on with life and enjoy things. And yeah. So now I have grandkids. And
congratulations.
Life is cooking along just great.
Oh, fantastic. I hesitate to talk about it, but I have my first child coming, and I am over the moon.
Yeah, I remember that feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, being a grandparent is like that to the 10th power. Something to look forward to, and you will not believe it until it happens to you. Then you'll believe it.
Yeah, they always talk about the way you think changes.
It does.
And pretty much the moment we found out, I could tell that I'm like, all right, priorities changed. It was just a natural switch.
Yep. Well, and your brain chemistry actually shifts in measurable ways. Both parents, hormone levels shift. There's all kinds of things that happen. And again, that's archetypal. And all of a sudden now there's the father and the child, and they have super important stuff that goes into that. All the ancestral memory, very much like the cold reflex that I was talking about earlier, only focused on the social roles. Those are universal. And I think if people could potentially be, if it were possible to raise somebody without any contact with anybody else, that would kill most people. But if it were possible, they would still have dreams about the sun god and about the hero's journey and the dragon and all the alchemical symbolism, right? I haven't even gotten touched on that stuff, which you have a lot in Ashen Rider, I'll tell you that much. But there you go.
Interesting. I'm a little bit curious what you saw in there that I might not have put there intentionally, because Ashen Rider was mostly intrinsic effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how it felt to me. One of the things I liked that you did was there's a trend now to where every single like micro reaction must be described so that the reader feels as though it's happening to them. It's even more prominent in YA lit. And you don't do that, right? You just get on with things, which I really like, because I felt like, and that gave it, to me, interestingly enough, it gave it more weight, because every word that's on the page is taking up space, and if it's not there for a good reason, then it probably should get gone. And if the whole goal of it is to make you feel super immersed in the immediacy of the character, fine, that works fine. I didn't get the sense that, or at least that was not my experience of reading Ashen Rider. It was more like, this is a bigger story that needs to be told, and it needs to be not told in 11 volumes of 900 pages each, right? It's not that. It's not a Steven Erikson, extravaganza or anything like that. Nevertheless, so everything that's happening there has got heft to it. And I feel like you would almost, I could be wrong, but I feel like you'd almost have to be speaking from the heart like that and from the gut to tell a story like that. It would be hard to mimic that, I think.
I agree. Because I honestly don't know where the hell that story came from. A lot of my writing is very much, so the next two books are about largely people living on the country, instead of this epic spanning giant, like the second book's all in one village over the course of a few weeks. It's about twice the length. It's already twice the length. I'm not done with it yet. But Ashen Rider is this crazy epic, and I wrote it in 45,000 words. Yeah. And I think a big part of that was the serial format. I had 5 parts, because we did, technically it's 6, but we have a prelude story, which I used that to do a short story that kind of warmed people up to my switching of perspective. And so I had done like a traditional, or not, I started with first person in that short story, went to my fictional version of the Aeneid, and then or the Iliad, either one, and then did more of a third person thing, and then just to try to get people to realize that I'm going to play with this. And then I had 5 parts to tell this crazy story, and I had originally thought that I was going to go through every layer of hell and go down each one, and I'm like, it's already been done. We don't need to.
Dante covered that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessary.
No, and just the reference of things there, I think, carry the. I mean, mystery is good. You don't want to define everything. You want it to stay a little bit strange and weird. That helps the fantasy bloom.
Yeah, allows the imagination of the reader to do a little work. The novel can be found on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, any of those places. You want to see what else I'm up to, you can go to erikgoodwyn.com, Erik with a K, Goodwyn with a Y, and then you can see not only links to the Raven's Tale series, but also my scholarly stuff too, my nonfiction books. And then I'm on TikTok as the Imaginarium, same for YouTube, and I'm on Instagram as the Imaginarium 6. Apparently there were 5 more before me, I don't know. And so you can find my stuff there.